Hey guys, welcome to our first lecture on our brand new unit, the Civil Rights Movement, the modern Civil Rights Movement. We have been talking about civil rights the entire year in various parts of each unit, but this is the main unit where we will look at the modern Civil Rights Movement. We'll identify some of the major leaders and some of the major events that took place really in the 1950s and 60s is going to be our primary focus, although we will go back to the very end of the Civil War just to see how things progressed, of course, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment ending slavery. That is really where kind of the major story begins for civil rights. Now, I will tell you that with this virtual learning that we are doing, this unit traditionally has not come until later on in the semester. I've had to switch some things around. I've actually decided to combine two units for our very last unit. Usually after World War II, I go straight into the Cold War. We look at how tensions rose with the Soviet Union and the United States. But I've decided to actually combine that with our last unit. So we will be studying that at the very end, mainly because I did want to make sure that we spent enough time on civil rights, and I want to make sure that you guys understood one of the most important units of study in all of American history. It's, this is a unit, too many teachers, I think, just teach it as black and white. This is a unit about equality. This is a movement about all Americans, regardless of race, creed, religion. This is a movement about being equal in the eyes of the law, being equal in society. So I'm excited to start this journey with you guys. And, as with all my units, this is a survey course. I wish we had plenty of time to go over everything as in-depth. I mean, you could study this topic your entire career and still not explore all of it. So with that being said, I do want to jump into it. So let me go ahead and pull up the lecture. All right, there we go. So we are going to get started here. And as you could tell, we're going to identify some very famous individuals and events throughout this unit, with our main focus being in the 1950s and 60s. But we have to go way back in order for us to understand the modern story. And so I will actually begin here at Reconstruction. With my IB classes, we have just wrapped up our Civil War unit, and the phrase that I have heard before, I did not invent this, but I think is very accurate, is that the North won the war, but the South won Reconstruction. And that is an extremely accurate portrayal of American history in the period of the 1860s and 70s on. So you had this tremendous moment in American history where the North had just defeated the South. The armies have gone home, and we're trying to reincorporate all of Southern society. Beyond that, our society has changed tremendously. You had 4 million enslaved peoples in the South, and all of a sudden they are free. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for people who had, for many parts of the South, it was illegal to educate your slaves. So you have no education. You probably have a skill of some sort, unless you were a hand laborer out in the field. So you might not even have a skill. No money to speak of. But yeah, you've just gained your freedom, which is of course, extremely important. But without any money, without any skills, without any education, what can you do? Where do you go? Well, you can't go back home. Where's home, right? I mean, the last 5 generations of your family lived at this plantation as slaves. What do you do? For many slaves, they had very few options moving forward. Freed slaves, I should say. They had very few options, and it is well documented that sadly, for many former slaves, they ended up, frankly, right back at the same plantations and farms that they had grown up on. Technically working as wage laborers. Often that was not the case. What we are going to see here soon is the development of sharecropping, and that really it was slavery by a different name, and I'm going to use that term a lot. But we see during this period of Reconstruction the emergence of sharecropping that tied people to the land without them owning it, and really kept, especially recently freed slaves, in really a state of servitude, where they had to stay on the land. In fact, in some parts, I mean, were beaten. I mean, in many ways, this remains kind of the same. So this period that we're going to look at first is Reconstruction. We have to understand during the 1870s how after the Civil War, even though people became legally free, socially, economically, they were not. Okay, they were not. They were not free, and some historians have argued that that would continue for decades. Okay, that would continue for decades, and obviously, there's still major issues regarding social equality in our nation. Otherwise, things, like what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few years back with Michael Brown being shot and killed, a young black man being shot and killed by police. Regardless of your stance on that situation, what we're saying here is that there are still major racial issues in the United States that are active. And I truly believe you have to go as far back as Reconstruction to really understand why those issues still exist. So, I want to go ahead and, again, I want to begin by taking a look at what happened, what decisions, what policies were being made in this post-Civil War era. There's a spelling error on here, disfranchise. The proper word is disenfranchisement, okay, disenfranchisement. So what we're going to see here is that black people in the South, throughout the country, really, are going to find themselves disenfranchised, meaning that they are not a part of the system. The South in particular, they are going to, they're going to win Reconstruction because they are going to put in policies and laws that basically stop black people from participating in the democracy in the South, that keep them out of making decisions for really themselves, for the public, for their communities. And, the first way you do this is you stop them from voting. You stop them from having any kind of voice in the public sphere. So what we're going to see is that there are numerous ways in which blacks are kept from voting in the South through things like poll taxes. Many of these, recently freed African Americans are broke. They're penniless. They have nothing, and they can't afford to pay a tax at the polls to go vote. It's not going to happen. Or literacy tests. Many of these people couldn't read or write. So, there were ways that many Southern, and this was going on across the country. This was not just a Southern thing, although that was kind of the epicenter of it. But there were different ways that they were finding to stop them from participating. The issue of segregation is going to be the major kind of defining factor of Jim Crow. This idea of segregating society, separating out white and blacks, and I not just white and blacks, right? I mean, we're talking about all the term that would have been used at the time. Coloreds, you would see this, on signs, whites only, for restaurants or laundries or whatever it may be. There would be a colored section of, theaters, and that was the official terminology that they used. It was legal, and it became legal because of an 1896 ruling called Plessy versus Ferguson. I believe we covered this in the first semester during our second unit when we were looking at the Reform era. But just a reminder, in 1896, you had Homer Plessy, who was a very fair-skinned African American in New Orleans. He was about 1/8 black. He was physically removed, arrested for sitting in the whites-only section of a railroad car. And remember, we talked about how that had allusions to Rosa Parks' situation later on in the 1950s. Homer Plessy took his case with the help of the NAACP all the way up to the Supreme Court. This was kind of that pivotal moment. The Supreme Court could have said, no, segregation is illegal. And it may have been over with, right? They could have began enforcing that in the South. It's not what happened. Instead, the court went the opposite way. And they said because the railroad company had provided a separate but equal facility, a separate but equal railroad car, that they were, in fact, within their legal rights to segregate black and white citizens. So since they had provided a separate but equal, that is the phrase that is very important to understand, a separate but equal accommodation, that they were within their legal framework. What this means, the implications of this court case are tremendous. I mean, this is going to last. I mean, this sets our country back really 60 plus years, if not longer. I truly believe that. This is, in my eyes, the worst Supreme Court case ever decided. It really sets us back the better half of a century. What this means is that now that segregation is legal, the South can go all in. Okay, they are all in on Jim Crow. They are all in on segregation. And as you can see in the bottom there, this means that everything is going to be segregated. Water fountains, public transportation, restaurants, everything will be legally segregated. And as you can imagine, the South is just going to run with that. So what we see during this era are the development of what are called Jim Crow laws. And these are segregation laws. These are laws aimed at separating the races. For many African Americans, especially in the South, by the time we get to the early 20th century, especially the 19 teens, 1920s, we start to see an impetus to leave the region. And not only by this point have some began to, economically, get enough money to actually leave. But also, and the more defining characteristic is that the South is incredibly dangerous for them. We will talk later on about lynchings that are happening. I mean, there were thousands of people that were being lynched, illegally murdered by mobs, and almost always for racial reasons. So, many people are escaping the South during this time. In particular, during World War I, there are going to be jobs opening up in the North, industrial jobs that many African Americans had never had the opportunity to hold before. And so we do start to see, as a result of this increasing, clutch on Southern society, some are starting to escape the South because of that. World War II is a tremendous turning point in the history of civil rights. 700,000 African Americans are going to fight in World War II. Keep in mind that the discrimination in America is very much different from discrimination elsewhere in the globe, and so for many of these African Americans, even though the military is still segregated, okay, when they are over fighting, and they are doing things like liberating Paris, and they're sitting down in a cafe in Paris, they're treated like everyone else. They've never experienced that before. Okay, even in their homeland. I mean, they come home, they are experiencing nothing like that. They're not even allowed to eat in, certain restaurants or cafeterias. So, to have that experience of what equality tastes like, many of those men will never forget that. Some stay over in Europe, but for those that come back, this is that spark where they actually realize that they are not free in America. They are not free. And this is the 1940s. It was my grandparents' generation. And it's not as if this was, the light bulb went off, but, many of them knew that the situation back at home was not one of equality or freedom, of course. But, this just made it even more obvious. And so you do have these almost million men strong that return back to social life. There is this great desire among veterans to help end those discriminatory practices. There are, for those African Americans that stay in the United States during World War II, they reap benefits of job shortages throughout the country. And so, once again, you have African Americans who traditionally had not been hired in many factories and many different industrial situations, and now all of a sudden they are able to get those jobs, often with better pay than what they would have had. Once again, escaping sharecropping. So the labor shortages due to World War II have a tremendous benefit for the African American community as well. As you can tell here, the next few images, next few slides are going to be difficult to look at. We are going to talk about the violence in the Jim Crow South over a 60-year period, really starting from Plessy versus Ferguson up to the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s. The violence is something that must be discussed in order to understand the impetus for the modern civil rights movement, but also, again, I think distrust that still remains today in many African American communities of either law enforcement or just power structures that because for decades primarily African Americans were being lynched without any type of justice at all, and absolutely horrendous. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. Just to define lynching. Lynching is a term where you have kind of a mob violence murder, or just a murder that takes place outside the bounds of the law. Often, especially in the South during Jim Crow era, this would most likely have targeted African Americans, but there were others. There were whites that were wrapped up in this as well. I do have some specific numbers. In the South, over this period that we're looking at, there were 3,446 African Americans that were lynched on record. Many others went missing and were never found. And there were almost 1,300 whites that were executed. And you might wonder, why would whites be targeted? Anyone pushing for change in the South would have been putting a target on their back. Also, anyone that perhaps had an interracial relationship would have been a target of this as well. The purpose of the Jim Crow, and this is perhaps the biggest point I can make here. What groups like the KKK are doing here, they are using lynching to terrorize. This is terrorism, right? This is terrorism. This is on the same level of Al-Qaeda. This is on the same level as Taliban. I mean, all these groups that, there's no justice here. These people are being murdered to keep a social and political structure in place. All right. If you step out of line, you will find a target on your back. The purpose of lynching is to terrorize people into submission. All right. For me, it's such a foreign concept from the life that I grew up in. But this was reality and reality for many African Americans in this period. Thousands of people are being murdered to keep a social structure in place. This is the legacy of the Jim Crow era. The next, I'm about to switch slides here, and I will warn you that the images are quite graphic. I've chosen to include them because I think they are important to understand the horrendous legacy of this story, and I think it adds a little bit more realism to it because stories are just stories until we see them and interact with them. The next story I would like to tell is the story. Oh, excuse me. There are the statistics that I had mentioned earlier. Feel free to pause and write those down if you didn't get them the first time. But the next story I sadly want to tell you is the story of Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old young boy. For those in my class, many of you are 14 years old, a little bit older perhaps at this point, but he was a young African-American boy from Chicago who decided to go down one summer to spend the summer with his cousins in Mississippi. Chicago was not immune to the racism that was being inflicted in this country, but it was different, right? It was very different. It was more about proximity than it was about, stepping out of line. When he goes into the South, in fact, his mom tells him as he's boarding the train, you got to be careful. She warns him, the South is different, but he doesn't quite get it. He doesn't quite get that line, that invisible line that can be crossed. And not that this is any fault of his own. It is absolutely not. I mean, this is a murder, cold-blooded murder. The story goes that Emmett Till, after he arrived in Mississippi, had been there a few weeks, where he and his cousins decided to go to a local grocer in Money, Mississippi, a very, very small town. And at this point, there are numerous stories that kind of emerge of what happened next. it was his friends believe that on his way out of this grocer, he had whistled or said something like "Bye, baby" to the white woman behind the counter. She became infuriated. She chased Emmett Till out of the store, and basically they ran off thinking that she was going to get a gun. But here, all he did was whistled at her, perhaps said something, a short little sentence, but crossed that line. Right, he crossed that line in the South that uh, black boys and girls, men and women, were not supposed to cross. The woman came out, or excuse me, the woman did tell her husband, who got his brother-in-law, and they decided to find Emmett Till. And they tracked Emmett Till down to his uncle's house, who he was staying with. They kidnapped Emmett Till. They tortured the young boy. They eventually did end up killing him, shooting him in the head after brutally torturing him. And they threw his body into the river with a gin fan tied around his neck to drag him to the bottom. His body would be recovered weeks later, and sadly, as you can see there, extremely bloated, disfigured, absolutely tragic. Emmett Till's body was shipped back home to Chicago. It was ordered by Mississippi authorities to be sealed. His mother refused that order and basically forced the funeral director to open his casket, and they would have an open casket. Mamie Till took a lot of heat for that decision with how grotesque his body had deformed over the last few weeks. But during his funeral, over the next few days, thousands upon thousands of African Americans and whites alike would come see and pay their respects to Emmett Till in Chicago. This is the spark of the modern civil rights movement. When people all across the country see these photographs, when people all across the country and the world see what is happening in the South still to this day, right? This is 1950s. When they see the brutality that can be inflicted upon a 14-year-old boy, they are outraged. They are absolutely outraged. Not just the violence, but the lack of justice. The two men that were involved, that committed this murder, they were arrested for kidnapping, for murder. They admitted to actually kidnapping Emmett Till, but they did. They said that they let him go. They were acquitted by an all-white jury in Mississippi. So they were acquitted of this crime, and they were released. To make matter, and this is the most sickening part of the story in my mind, a few years later, both men actually made money off of this. They, knowing that they would be protected by what are called double jeopardy rules, where you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. You cannot be tried for the same murder twice. Both of these men would agree to sell their stories to a magazine, and they publicly, nationally, globally admitted, not just admitted to killing Emmett Till, but they went step by step on how they had actually killed him. So you have this outrage across the country. You have this outrage among all populations. How could this happen, right? How could this still be the case in the South? People understood the South was pretty bad, but no one, I shouldn't say no one, but many did not understand that it was this bad still. So, Emmett Till was that catalyst. He was that spark of change for the modern civil rights movement. I don't know if you have it at this time without Emmett Till being killed. It would have come eventually, but it was such a tragic moment in American history for such an innocent young boy that the entire nation changed because of this. So let's take a look at that change. One, I could have introduced him later on, but one important African American figure that everyone should know is Thurgood Marshall. Now, later on, he will become the first African American Supreme Court justice, but he does begin his work as an NAACP lawyer, arguing civil rights cases. He would successfully lead the charge in the Brown versus Board of Education case that I'm about to talk about. So I wanted to introduce Thurgood Marshall before that case, but he would be a very important figure in American history. Let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education, the first of these civil rights Supreme Court cases that is extremely important. Of course, schools were segregated, just like the rest of society, and that included in places like our hometown, Lee Summit, but also in in various states throughout the country. Segregation was not just a Southern thing; it was everywhere. And so, anyways, the case Brown versus Board of Education actually takes place in Topeka, Kansas. And it involved multiple families. There were multiple families that got in on this court case, but it centered around a little girl, 9 years old, Linda Brown, who, because she was an African American, had to go to the black school in town. Well, the problem was the black school was all the way on the other side of town, and this 9-year-old girl had to cross not only multiple roads, but also railroad tracks, dangerous railroad tracks, to get to this school. Her family argued that she should have the rights to go to the all-white school in Topeka. It was safer, it was a better school, and that ultimately this segregation was illegal, was putting their daughter in harm's way. The Supreme Court agreed. Thurgood Marshall argued this case, and the Supreme Court agreed. And the wording of this is amazing because they knew that this would overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, and so they actually used the same terminology. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. All right, that was the law. What Brown versus Board of Education does is it says that separate is inherently unequal. Separate is inherently unequal, right? If you are a person of color and you get on board public transportation and you're told you have to sit in the back of the bus or you have to move to the back of the train, you're having an unequal experience, right? If you are an African American, you are told you have to go to this school, right? Because of your skin color, you're having an unequal experience versus a white student who could choose. So many, this law will just apply to school segregation. So this is not in segregation throughout, but it will begin to be applied in other areas. And this is the beginning of the end for segregation. And you better believe that the South is going to fight against this, right? The South is they're going to be forced to integrate, but boy, they don't do it right away. And they really resist. Really, and this, I'm sure it's not the case, but the only case that I know of in which the Supreme Court actually had to come back down with a second ruling saying that they had to move with all deliberate speed. Okay, that Southern states were taking too much of their time to make this happen. Because these states were saying, oh, these things take time, right? You can't just integrate overnight. How are you going to? These things take time. Well, many of them had like 10-year plans for this to happen. So the Supreme Court actually comes back, says you have to do this intentionally with all deliberate speed. Even 2 years later, many states had not integrated their schools. 1957, the case of the Little Rock Nine, the governor of Arkansas refused entry to 9 African-American students who had registered with the school. President Eisenhower of the federal government is going to have to step in and basically allow these students to go to school. Eisenhower will federalize the National Guard in Arkansas and will escort these brave students into Little Rock High School. I wish we had more time to go into this. I can't imagine being those students. It's hard enough being that age. It's hard enough going, living social lives. But man, to open up your door every day and to see an angry mob outside waiting, and you don't know if anyone's going to, act on that. You don't know if anybody's actually going to, have a gun or whatnot. So, to not know, it would be so scary. So scary. Very, very brave boys and girls that helped integrate that school and really the nation. That same year, future President Lyndon Baines Johnson will introduce the Civil Rights Act of 1957. I will tell you that there are two Civil Rights Acts we will discuss in this unit. This is the first one, and it's very important. It allows the Attorney General to institute a lot of these civil rights programs, to desegregate various areas, in particular with voting rights. Okay, this is going to allow the federal government to step in and say, no, you have to allow these people to register to vote, to actually participate in their government. We'll talk about the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s later on. Very, very important. The next major moment, kind of iconic moments of the modern civil rights era, is the Montgomery bus boycott. And this is probably one that you're most familiar with. Rosa Parks, who I mentioned earlier, young African-American woman in Montgomery, Alabama, actually was a member of the NAACP. She got on board a bus, which was fully segregated, and sat down in the front when a white man got on board. Basically, the bus driver told her to move to the back of the bus to allow him, to have that seat. And Rosa Parks refused. She was subsequently arrested, and this sparked a full boycott of the public transportation system in Montgomery. A young man was selected, a really unknown preacher, 26 years old. I know that sounds old to my students. Trust me, that is not old. 26 years old. I don't even, God knows what I don't even want to think of what I was doing at 26 years old. Just, immature or whatever. But 26 years old, this young unknown pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was selected to lead this boycott. This is going to be his first public leadership role. He had a small congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, but he will come to Alabama, to lead this boycott. The boycott would last over a full year, and African Americans in Montgomery sacrificed a lot, having to walk to their works. They organized as a community to help ride share and things like that. Dr. King was subject to violence himself. His home was bombed. Could have killed his wife, his kids. Ultimately, the Supreme Court would rule on the Montgomery bus segregation, and they did outlaw that segregation. Dr. King would be the very first one on board a bus. He sits in the very front, and as you can see there, he said it was a great ride. Fairly modest for a major moment here in sparking the civil rights movement. So what did the Montgomery bus boycott do? Well, of course, not only ended bus segregation, but it showed the ability of the civil rights movement, what they could do when they really united together peacefully, right? And that's the other part of this. Dr. King is going to dedicate his life to peaceful civil disobedience. You can handle unjust laws peacefully, and frankly, sometimes that's more powerful than any type of radical, violent retribution. Dr. King would go on to lead and join a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. It was made up of ministers all throughout the South, and their goal was to create this nonviolent crusade against the evils of second-class citizenship. They would stage demonstrations all throughout the South, sit-ins. We'll talk about different types of protests that they took part in, but all across the South, these kind of things are happening. Now, they're learning from each of these sit-ins, each of these protests, and what they're also realizing is the power of the media. And the picture down at the lower right, take a look at that picture. Brutal scene here, where you have this young teenage boy who was peacefully protesting, and this was actually in Birmingham, Alabama, and here you have the police in Birmingham attacking him with police dogs. This scene was broadcast all across the nation, and what reminded Americans, by this point they're seeing it, in their living rooms with their televisions. When they're seeing these images coming out of the South, they're saying, "What is happening down there?" In fact, it's after this scene that President Kennedy would actually get involved and say, we have to have a major civil rights bill, which would eventually turn into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Others are starting to get involved. You had a group made up of all races coming from the North called Freedom Riders. They would travel by bus, often by bus to the South, not only to protest segregation, but also to try and register people to vote. That was the first step after disenfranchisement, to get people registered to where they could have a voice in their political sphere and represent, have people that represented them. Many of these people were targeted with violence. Many of their buses were bombed. There were multiple Freedom Riders that were killed because they were coming down trying to disrupt Southern society. I found this to be a very interesting poll. This was given by Gallup, which is the national polling organization. You can see here, this poll was given in 1963, and you can see actually most people in 1963 disapproved of what the Freedom Riders were doing. I think this is such a telling moment for us because, listen, often people that push against mainstream, often people that push and try to disrupt mainstream ideas in the moment are often seen as troublemakers. They're often seen as people that are lawless. In this case, even the second one, do you think these sit-ins hurt or help? Today we look at sit-ins as one of the most iconic parts of the civil rights movement, but they're actually saying in these polls, people felt like it hurt the cause. Most people don't like change. And I'm talking about humankind here. Most people do not like change, right? And so to try and push for change, especially when it's going to disrupt an entire country, most people were not for that. Even though they knew that blacks had been mistreated in the South, were being killed in the South, they still they didn't think that this was the appropriate way. Not to get political. I think we've seen this in our own time, though. With the Kaepernick, when Colin Kaepernick, quarterback for the 49ers, when he took a knee during the national anthem, a lot of people disapproved of that peaceful protest, and a lot of other people said, okay, well, if you don't want him, kneeling, then what is he supposed to do? What other forms of protest is there? So, these kind of things, I'm not agreeing, disagreeing. I'm not taking a stand. I'm just saying that this is another example of how, when people push issues, and he publicly stated, this is because, Black people are getting shot and killed in this country. And, I wanted to bring light to that. People need to know that this is happening, so, a lot of people said, he was well within his rights to do that, freedom of speech. Others said it was disrespectful. That's for everyone to decide on their own. In the moment, though, a lot of people think that those that are disrupting normalize society in those ways are actually doing a disservice. Years later, often, like in this situation, the freedom rider is a major part of our unit, right? So a lot of times, even at the very bottom, the March on Washington, unfavorable. Your feelings about the mass protest. I mean, that's the speech where Dr. King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech. The most iconic moment in the entire civil rights era. 60% saw that protest as being unfavorable in the moment. We have to be careful about how we judge, especially peaceful actions in the moment when they're pushing mainstream ideas. Not saying that they, all are right, but, polls like this really show us that sometimes we are unwilling to give up our traditional. People don't like confrontation. People don't like change, but sometimes change is necessary. Dr. King would often be arrested for his role in leading these things. In Birmingham, he was arrested, and he used his time to write a series of letters secretly in response to ministers who had actually been calling him out, saying that what he was doing was inappropriate, that, this was actually Easter weekend. Easter's enormous, affair in Christian churches. And here he was in prison, in jail, instead of being with his congregation. A lot of ministers criticized him for that. What are you doing? Like, why would you go and get arrested, on this important weekend? And he responds to them all. And he gives some of the most eloquent responses that really define the entire movement. One of my favorite phrases is that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Uh, Absolutely correct. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If they can get away with it in the South, why can't they get away with it elsewhere? Right? And the fact that people are having to deal with it in the South and we're turning a blind eye to it, those people need equality and freedom as well. So very eloquent, more so than I ever could be, and showed why he was really the true leader of the civil rights movement. The Children's Crusade was another major moment in this. May 3rd, 1963. You had over 1,000 kids who peacefully assembled to protest. And this is that picture I showed earlier of the young boy being bitten by the dog. This is when the police came out and they used high-pressured water hoses. They used police dogs. And this is that moment where President Kennedy says, this has to end. And this is the kind of the brainchild for the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And for those in my class that are watching this, this is a key moment I want you to understand. These are kids. These are kids that are bringing about the most important Civil Rights Act in our nation's history. It's because of this moment right here. Kids that are 8, 9, 13, 14, 15 years old. They are the ones responsible for bringing the Civil Rights Act, the necessity of the Civil Rights Act at a federal level. I wanted to introduce Medgar Evers, another civil rights figure during this period. He was a member of the NAACP. He was a field officer. He would often, represent the community for the NAACP. World War II veteran. When he arrived home one day after work, just a normal day of work, he stepped out of his car in his driveway, and in the street pulled up a white supremacist, the man in the lower left-hand corner, who pulled out a rifle and shot and killed Medgar Evers. The man was arrested later on. He was tried once again by 2 juries because they both resulted in hung juries. Even if you have one person on the jury that says, hey, you didn't do it, you have to have unanimous consent for murder trials. So both of the trials resulted in hung juries. Here we are, literally a decade after Emmett Till, and you still have a black man being shot down in his driveway by a white man. All evidence points to the fact he did it, and yet all of a sudden he is released because justice is not being had. The fact is that a black man can be killed still in this country, and the white man, very, very evidently responsible for it, is not held to account. That's not justice. This will bring a new militancy to the cause. People are angry. The people start disagreeing with Dr. King. We've been playing by the rules this entire time, and people are still getting killed, and justice is not happening. I want to introduce Malcolm X, who will be kind of the opposing figure. Both men wanted, in some ways, the same thing, but ultimately very vastly different ways to get there. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, he did change his name because he believed that it represented his slave name. He changed his name to Malcolm X. He had a very rough upbringing. He was in and out of jail most of his young life. When he was 20 years old, he went to prison and began studying a group called the Nation of Islam, and it was led by a man named Elijah Muhammad. He does convert to Islam, becomes a Muslim, and is raised in this African-American centered faith, this version of Islam. So I don't know if it'd be appropriate to use the word denomination of Islam, but kind of like that. This was a group formed in the United States that primarily focused on African-Americans in converting to Islam. So Malcolm X becomes this leading figure, in some ways, the exact polar opposite of Dr. King, right? This Christian preacher preaching about peace and nonviolence. Now you got Malcolm X on the other side, and he's not calling for all-out violence. What he's calling for is self-defense, right? Instead of turning the other cheek, you have to defend yourself, right? If you allow yourself to be shot, it's too late, right? You have to defend yourself. So he actually proposes arming African Americans and promoting this idea of self-defense. That is pretty chilling ideas for whites to hear. So, they paint Malcolm X as a radical. They're very frightened by his ideas. And the Nation of Islam actually does start to get some negative press associated with it. And it does create some resentment among its members. And I mention that because that will sadly become key towards the end of Malcolm X's life. Malcolm X does start to change his message a little bit. In March of 1964, Malcolm X would travel to Mecca. All the according to the Islamic belief, the 5 pillars of Islam, one of those pillars is that if you have the ability, you must travel to Mecca. You have to make that pilgrimage, right? Malcolm X does that here. And while he is there, he studies with Islamic leaders, and he realizes his message needs to change, that he does need to give peace more of a chance than what he has perhaps before. And so he develops a new slogan to be used, and it's called ballots or bullets. Okay, ballots or bullets. And he says, listen, we need to use nonviolence first and foremost. Use the system to get the system changed. But if people don't have a voice, if people are not allowed to participate in the political realm, they will lash out, right? There will come a point of violence. I wholeheartedly agree with that. If you stifle people's voices, okay, they will lash out in other ways. That's a human fact, right? And in this case, he's saying if you do not allow African Americans to, have a say in their political system, in their communities, they're going to lash out, right? It will come down to bullets, and he was absolutely right. So, we will continue on next lecture by talking about some of the major protests, as we've already seen, talk about the different types, the nonviolent and some that did turn more violent. So anyways, guys, as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to email me, and I'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks again.